1968, a behavioral scientist named John B. Calhoun placed 8 healthy mice into what he believed was a perfect world. There was unlimited food, unlimited water, stable temperature, no predators, no disease, no weather, no resource scarcity of any kind. By day 920, no more babies were being born. By the end of the experiment, every mouse inside was dead. The food had not run out. The water had not run out. The enclosure had not failed. Nothing physical in the obvious sense had broken. What failed was behavior. Calhoun called it a behavioral sink. And what happened inside that enclosure became one of the most disturbing experiments ever run on a social species. Because the collapse did not begin with hunger, disease, or attack. It began when the colony stopped knowing how to continue itself. This experiment is usually called Universe 25. The number mattered because it was not Calhoun's first attempt. By the time he built it, he had already run 24 versions of population experiments with rats and mice. Forest enclosures, barns, laboratory colonies, controlled habitats, all built around one question. What happens to a social population when the normal limits disappear? Calhoun was not interested in starvation. Everyone already knew starvation killed populations. He wanted to know what happened when you removed the obvious causes of failure and left only density, contact, and social life. Universe 25 was designed to be the clean answer. The enclosure was roughly 9 feet by 9 feet with multiple levels, tunnels, feeding stations, and nesting boxes arranged, so that, in principle, it could support nearly 4,000 mice. It was cleaned and maintained regularly. The founding mice were selected from healthy stock. No population in nature gets conditions this forgiving. At first, the experiment looked like a complete success. For the first 100 days, the mice explored, adjusted, formed territories, and began breeding normally. The population started doubling approximately every 55 days. New litters appeared, the colony expanded, the system worked. If you had looked only at those early numbers, you would have assumed Calhoun had created the ideal environment for social mammals. That is what makes what followed so difficult to dismiss. The population did not reach the enclosure's physical carrying capacity before things started going wrong. It failed well before that. At around 600 mice, something fundamental shifted. There was still space in the geometric sense, still food, still water. But the social architecture of the colony started to collapse under pressures the physical design had not solved. The younger males were the first visible sign. In a normal mouse colony, males establish territory. They defend it, mate within it, and maintain a role that gives structure to the wider colony. In Universe 25, as the number of males increased and the best positions were already occupied, many younger males failed to secure any meaningful role at all. They began clustering in the center of the enclosure, not organizing, not adapting, drifting. They were physically alive and socially displaced. Calhoun watched them absorb repeated attacks from dominant males without developing stable defensive behavior. They would be bitten, driven off, relocate a short distance, and settle again without real strategy. They did not become rival leaders. They did not carve out a new social order. They simply accumulated in areas of traffic and instability. This was not just crowding. That distinction matters. The problem was not that too many bodies existed in one place. The problem was that the system stopped generating enough meaningful positions for those bodies to occupy. A social mammal can survive pressure. It does not survive the collapse of role. At the same time, a second group of males began behaving in the opposite way. Hyperactive, aggressive, intrusive. They forced themselves into nests, interrupted social patterns, attacked without obvious strategic reason. Instead of order, the colony started producing noise. This is the moment Calhoun identified the behavioral sink. Not a single event, a direction, a drift toward distortion. The term became famous because it described something people could feel immediately. A sink is a place where things go to disappear. In Universe 25, normal social behavior was disappearing. Not all at once, not evenly, but steadily enough that by the time the worst symptoms appeared, the deeper failure had already happened. Then the females changed. This is where the experiment becomes much darker than most summaries make it sound. In a healthy mouse colony, maternal behavior is one of the most stable systems in the whole structure. Mothers build nests, nurse, retrieve pups, defend them, and prepare the next generation to enter the colony's social world. In Universe 25, under the pressure of repeated intrusion and social instability, many females began to lose that function. Some abandoned their young. Some failed to nurse. Some became aggressive toward their litters. Some stopped reproducing altogether and withdrew to the upper nesting boxes, living in isolation away from the colony's central disorder. Infant mortality surged. At points, fewer than 1 in 20 pups survived to weaning in some parts of the enclosure. This is the line where most people think the experiment becomes about cruelty. It is worse than that. It became about discontinuity. The colony was not just failing to be kind to its young, it was failing to produce the conditions under which the next generation could even learn what being a mouse was supposed to look like. The young that survived grew up inside a system where courtship was unstable, parenting was unreliable, territory was incoherent, and social behavior was no longer being modeled consistently. The food was still there. The future was not. If this kind of science, where the real horror is social rather than physical, is your thing, I make videos like this regularly, and I genuinely appreciate it if you subscribed. The most famous group in Universe 25 emerged from this failed generation. Calhoun called them the beautiful ones. They were mostly males, though some females behaved similarly. They withdrew from mating, withdrew from conflict, withdrew from parenting, withdrew from everything difficult. They spent their time eating, drinking, sleeping, and grooming themselves obsessively. Their fur was immaculate because they no longer fought. Their bodies remained visually undamaged because they had opted out of the social world entirely. They looked healthy. That is why the phrase stuck. The beautiful ones were not visibly broken. They were the least visibly damaged animals in the enclosure. But they were also functionally finished. They did not mate, did not defend territory, did not rear offspring. They survived physically while contributing nothing to the continuation of the colony. This is one of the coldest facts in the entire experiment. The mice that looked best were already done. And this is the point where people usually misread the whole thing. They say Universe 25 proves that comfort destroys discipline, that paradise makes creatures weak, that easy life kills civilization. Those are catchy conclusions. They are also too shallow to be useful. Calhoun's interpretation was more precise. He argued that the deepest problem was not abundance. It was the disappearance of meaningful roles. When too many individuals exist relative to the number of stable social functions available to them, disorder follows, not because the food is abundant, but because the social architecture no longer tells enough of them how to matter. That is a very different claim. The killer was not comfort. The killer was role collapse. This is why the experiment still matters. Not because humans are mice. We are not. Humans build institutions. Humans preserve memory outside the body. Humans create new roles when old ones fail. Humans can redesign a social world deliberately in ways mice cannot. Mice do not invent schools, laws, therapy, religion, bureaucracy, art, or philosophy as compensatory systems when old structures stop working. We do. But if you remove the lazy comparison and keep only the hard part, the experiment remains deeply uncomfortable. A population can have enough food and still stop reproducing meaningfully. A society can remain materially stable while behavior decays. Individuals can become physically healthy and socially finished at the same time, and a system can die before the bodies inside it do. Calhoun himself kept working because he believed this was not destiny. He believed social design mattered. He believed species with greater cognitive flexibility could generate what he later called ideational space, new forms of function, new roles, new reasons to participate when the old structures no longer worked. That is why Universe 25 is not a prophecy. It is a warning about design. The collapse did not begin when the first mouse died. It began when the colony stopped teaching itself how to continue. That is a different kind of death. Calhoun called it the first death. The death of behaviour came before the death of the body. Once courtship, parenting, defence and meaningful role occupancy had degraded enough, the rest was timing. The colony was biologically alive and socially finished. By the end, mice were still eating in a perfectly provisioned world. There was still water, there were still nests, there was still warmth. And none of it was enough to reverse what had already been lost. That is the behavioural sink effect, not death by shortage, not death by violence. Death by the collapse of social function in a world where the physical conditions for survival were still intact. The food remained. The future did not.